The evening carried a warm glow, with soft conversation filling the room. The kind of setting where people pretended everything was perfect, even when tension quietly lingered beneath the surface. I sat at the table trying to blend into the background, hoping the night would stay calm and uneventful as I navigated the fragile space between silence and discomfort. But all of that shattered when Marceline's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and intentional. She leaned back with an expression of cold confidence, looking at me as if she were preparing to deliver a verdict she'd been saving for the perfect audience, and the shift in her posture made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. Then she released her words with cruel precision, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Callum, you're completely useless. Honestly, I don't know why you even show up if you contribute nothing." The room froze instantly as conversations died. Hands paused mid-motion, and a dropped spoon echoed like a warning bell. Before I could react or even take a full breath, a soft clink drew everyone's gaze toward the far end of the table, where Grandma Evelyn slowly placed her teacup down, rising with a steady calm that demanded silence. Her eyes, filled with storms and wisdom, swept through the room in a way that made even the proudest faces lower slightly as she prepared to speak. And in a voice gentle yet powerful, she said, "Before you speak another word, you should understand the truth about the man you just called useless," shifting the entire room's balance instantly. "My name is Callum Rhodes, and I never imagined a single evening could break a person so quietly that even breathing afterward felt heavier than before, as if disappointment had wrapped itself around my chest. I wasn't raised with the kind of praise that builds confidence, nor did I ever demand attention, choosing instead to be the quiet, steady presence who offered help without expecting anything back. But that night, my quiet nature wasn't seen as kindness. It was turned into ammunition. I believed effort mattered, even when unnoticed, and I believed love could soften the edges of difficult people if given enough time and patience. But Marceline's words didn't just humiliate me. They peeled away layers of false hope I'd wrapped around us, exposing how fragile and one-sided things had become. Yet what I didn't know was that the calmest person in the room, Grandma Evelyn, would change everything with a truth I never expected. This story isn't just about an insult or embarrassment. It's about the moment someone finally speaks the words you were too broken to say yourself, restoring a strength you didn't know you'd lost. It's about how humiliation can crush you, yet wisdom spoken softly can rebuild pieces of you that had been silent for years. And that moment, that shift in the air, became the beginning of a lesson I never saw coming. I grew up learning to stay quiet in rooms where louder voices always won, and maybe that's why being overlooked never surprised me, even when it stung more than I cared to admit. I didn't crave attention or applause. I simply believed small acts of kindness could still hold meaning, even if no one noticed them. With Marcelline, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw value in that softness. In the beginning, she admired my calm nature and the steady way I approached life, calling it grounding and comforting, something she claimed she needed. But slowly, almost silently, those same qualities turned into flaws in her eyes, and my gentle presence began to irritate her more than it soothed her. What once connected us started pushing us apart. Her reactions changed gradually, like a quiet tide pulling back before a storm, and I found myself adjusting constantly to avoid triggering her annoyance. She rolled her eyes at moments she once found endearing, sighed heavily when I spoke too long, and saved affection only for situations where others were watching. Each shift made me wonder what part of me had stopped being enough. When she invited me to her family dinner, I convinced myself it could be a chance to reconnect and maybe remind her of the warmth we once shared. I wanted to believe that sitting with her family might soften the distance growing between us, giving us a fresh space. Throughout dinner, I noticed Marceline's increasing irritation, the tapping of her nails, the averted gaze whenever I tried to join the conversation, and the subtle tension tightening her jaw. It felt like I was failing an invisible test, one I wasn't prepared for, yet one she expected me to pass without guidance. Every moment made me feel smaller. Then came the moment she delivered her insult, crafted with precision and spoken loudly enough to leave no room for misunderstanding or escape. The humiliation hit me in a way that left my breath trapped in my chest, making everything blur around the edges as if the room itself had turned cold. And in that blur, I felt something inside me crack quietly. I looked toward her, hoping to find even a flicker of regret or softness that might cushion the blow. But instead, I found triumph in her expression. She wasn't upset. She felt validated, as if humiliating me had earned her approval from the people she cared about more. And for a moment, I believed she might be right about me. But then my eyes met Grandma Evelyn's, and the depth in her gaze cut through the fog of my embarrassment with surprising clarity. She had witnessed every shift in the room, the cruelty, the silence, the tension, and she understood what others overlooked. In her expression, I saw something I hadn't felt all evening: understanding. When she stood up, the entire atmosphere shifted, as if the room recognized her authority before she even spoke. She wasn't intimidating through volume or force. She commanded attention through presence, the kind that comes from living a life full of storms and learning how to walk through all of them. And her rising meant something was about to change. As she prepared to speak, my thoughts spiraled into places I had avoided for years. Moments where I swallowed my feelings to keep peace, times when I let myself shrink so others could shine, and the countless ways I accepted being undervalued. For the first time, I wondered whether I had mistaken endurance for worth. That night didn't just expose the cracks in my relationship, it exposed the cracks in myself, the ones I had ignored, patched, and accepted for too long. And as Grandma Evelyn opened her mouth, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet shift I couldn't fully understand yet. Little did I know, her next words would become the first step toward rebuilding everything I thought I had lost. The moment Grandma Evelyn's voice filled the room, a strange stillness settled over my chest, as if someone had pressed pause on the chaos swirling through my thoughts. I sat frozen in my seat, unsure whether I should look at her, look at Marcelline, or simply disappear into the floor beneath me. But something in her tone made it impossible to hide, forcing my eyes upward, even as shame tried to pull them down. People who moments ago seemed eager to witness my humiliation now looked uncomfortable, as though they had been caught endorsing a cruelty they suddenly wished to distance themselves from. A few shifted in their seats, glancing between me and Marcelline, as if waiting to see which side they were supposed to stand on. And as the silence stretched, I felt a quiet ache spread inside me, a realization that my humiliation had become a spectacle none of them were willing to own. Marcelline remained shockingly composed, crossing her arms with a defensive confidence that barely masked the flicker of irritation in her eyes. She hadn't expected resistance, especially not from her grandmother, whose opinions carried a weight no one dared challenge. And as Grandma drew a slow breath, I watched Marcelline's posture stiffen, as if bracing for impact she could no longer control. Before Grandma could continue, my thoughts drifted inward, spiraling back into the heaviness settling beneath my ribs like an anchor. Humiliation has a way of echoing long after words are spoken, lodging itself deep where logic struggles to reach, and no amount of explanation can immediately soften its sting. I felt that echo now, pulsing every time the word useless replayed in my head with painful clarity. In that moment, I questioned everything: my worth, my place, my reasoning for staying in a relationship that now felt like a slow erosion of my identity. I wondered how long I had ignored the signs, how many times I had mistaken disrespect for frustration, and how often I convinced myself that things weren't as bad as they felt. I heard someone whisper, a hushed, uncomfortable mumble that only intensified my desire to disappear, to step outside and breathe air untouched by judgment. Yet even with the urge to escape clawing at me, a strange instinct rooted me to my chair, as if leaving now would only confirm their assumptions about my weakness. I stayed because running felt like surrender. When Grandma finally spoke again, her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of sorrow, not directed at me, but at the environment that allowed cruelty to be disguised as honesty. She spoke of resilience, of how some people survive storms not through noise but through endurance, and how silence is not a lack of strength, but a choice to avoid harm. Her words touched something raw inside me. As she continued, the room shifted further, and I felt eyes on me. Not with judgment this time, but with a mixture of confusion, reflection, and maybe even regret. People who had laughed earlier now seemed unsure of their place in the conversation, unsure whether to apologize silently or pretend they had never participated in the harm. That uncertainty created a strange comfort I hadn't expected. Still, despite Grandma's support, a battle raged quietly inside my chest, where doubt and validation collided. One part of me wanted to believe her, to accept her words as truth and let them soothe the wound Marcelline had created. But another part whispered questions. Why wasn't her voice enough earlier? Why did I need defending? And why did I feel so small even when someone stood up for me? Those questions didn't vanish just because someone else believed in me. After a tense pause, the dinner slowly resumed. Though the atmosphere had changed so drastically, it felt like a different evening entirely. Conversations became cautious, movements slowed, and no one dared mention the incident directly, as if acknowledging it would reopen a wound they preferred to pretend didn't exist. I remained quiet, not out of fear this time, but out of emotional exhaustion. When the meal finally ended, I excused myself and stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air that felt like relief against my burning skin. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket, offering a space to feel everything I had suppressed inside that suffocating room. And in the stillness, the weight of humiliation settled deeper, demanding to be acknowledged. I replayed the moment repeatedly, the words, the stares, the silence, and each replay carved new doubts I wasn't prepared to face. I'd been embarrassed before, but never like this, never by someone I trusted enough to let into the vulnerable parts of my heart. And the realization that she chose to break me publicly cut far deeper than the insult itself. Just when I felt myself sinking into those thoughts, the door opened softly behind me, and I turned to see Grandma Evelyn approaching with slow, intentional steps. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stood beside me, her presence steady like the anchor I desperately needed. And in that quiet moment, something inside me loosened. She placed a gentle hand on my arm, the kind of touch that didn't ask for anything but offered everything: understanding, comfort, and space to breathe. Her eyes held no judgment, only concern, as if she had witnessed the fracture inside me long before anyone else noticed. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of truth I wasn't ready for, but needed desperately. "Callum," she said. What I didn't know then was that this conversation, this quiet moment beneath the night sky, would become the turning point of everything that followed. Because wisdom doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins as a whisper, guiding you toward the person you were always meant to be. Grandma stood beside me in the cold night air, her presence steady enough to silence the storm still twisting inside my chest. She didn't rush me, didn't push me to speak, and didn't pretend the pain wasn't real. Instead, she let the quiet settle around us until my breathing finally slowed from trembling desperation to something close to steady. When she finally spoke again, her voice was gentle, yet carried a firmness that made each word feel intentional and heavy with meaning. She said some people mistake silence for weakness because they fear what they cannot control and they mock what they do not understand. Her words felt like a small light in a dark hallway, giving direction without forcing movement. I looked at her, unsure why she believed in me so fiercely when I struggled to believe in myself, and the sincerity in her eyes made it impossible to dismiss her comfort. She told me she had watched me closely over the years, noticing the quiet strength I didn't know how to claim, and the kindness I offered even when no one offered it back. Those truths felt unfamiliar, yet deeply needed. She spoke of her own youth, describing a time when she too was dismissed by people who valued volume over depth, and how she carried that wound until she realized her silence wasn't a flaw, but a choice. Hearing that made something inside me loosen, as if the pain had found a place to rest instead of tearing through me. As she continued, she said humiliation has a strange way of showing us what we've tolerated for too long. revealing not who we are, but who we've allowed others to convince us to be. Her perspective reframed everything, turning my shame into a reflection of their cruelty rather than my inadequacy. For the first time, I felt the narrative shifting. I asked her why Marcelline spoke to me the way she did, though I already feared the answer buried somewhere inside me. Grandma sighed softly before saying that arrogance often grows in people who feel threatened by gentleness because it mirrors what they lack and exposes their own insecurities. Hearing that made Marcelline's behavior suddenly click in painful clarity. Standing there with her, I felt anger and sadness twist together, forming a question I had avoided for years. Had I spent more time trying to be worthy of someone who never valued what I offered? The realization crept in slowly, unsettling yet somehow liberating. It made me confront the truth that love shouldn't require shrinking. Grandma placed her hand on my shoulder, steady and grounding, and told me that true strength isn't measured by how loudly someone speaks, but by how calmly someone rises after being pushed down. She said I had spent too long surviving rather than living, and that this moment might finally push me back toward myself. Her conviction felt like a lifeline. I felt the weight of her words settling deeper, creating a quiet clarity that had been missing for far too long. Her insight didn't erase the pain, but it gave purpose to it, showing me that humiliation could become a turning point rather than a dead end. When I finally followed her inside, the atmosphere felt different, not because the room had changed, but because I had. The stares no longer pierced the same way, the whispers no longer held the same weight, and even Marceline's cold gaze failed to shrink me the way it once did. I was still hurting, but I was no longer powerless. And as I stood there quietly, I realized that Grandma hadn't just defended me. She had awakened a part of me I thought no longer existed. The part that refused to be defined by someone else's cruelty. I didn't know what came next, but I knew something had begun inside me that couldn't be undone. The first thread of strength had returned. When I stepped back into the dining room, something in me felt steadier, as if Grandma's words had reshaped the ground beneath my feet. The same faces that once felt intimidating now looked uncertain, unsure how to interact with me after witnessing a scene none of them had expected. Their glances no longer cut into me. They simply slid past like fading echoes. Marcelline watched me from across the table, her expression tight with discomfort, as though she couldn't decide whether to defend herself or pretend nothing had happened. She had built her confidence on the assumption that I would always shrink under her words, but the quiet change in my posture unsettled her. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She looked exposed. I didn't confront her, nor did I attempt to soothe the tension she had created, because something inside me finally understood that silence didn't equal surrender. Instead, I moved with a calmness that felt foreign yet strangely natural, offering polite nods without bending myself to fit into their expectations anymore. This time I existed without apology. Her family tried to resume conversations, but the room felt disjointed, the warmth replaced by a stiff awkwardness that no one knew how to navigate. Every sentence carried hesitation, as if people feared adding pressure to a fragile atmosphere already shaped by unspoken truths. Their discomfort wasn't my responsibility, and for once I didn't absorb it. Marcelline cleared her throat and said my name softly, hoping to regain control of the narrative, but her voice lacked the dominance it once held. She gestured for me to sit beside her, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, as though trying to rewrite the memory of what she had done. But the mask she wore had already cracked. I took my seat without commenting, allowing the silence between us to stretch, not as punishment, but as space for truth to settle. Silence became my boundary, a place where I no longer needed to justify my pain or soften hers. And as the moments passed, she realized that my silence was no longer submission. It was recognition of my own worth. She attempted a small joke, something light meant to pull attention away from the tension, but no one laughed, not even her closest relatives. They looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed for her, as if witnessing her lose control of a story she thought she owned. It was the first time her performance failed. Her brother Bennett, shifted in his seat and glanced at me with a mixture of discomfort and sympathy, acknowledging the cruelty he had ignored earlier. Even he seemed unsure how to repair what had unfolded, recognizing that silence now carried meaning he could no longer pretend wasn't justified. His expression told me everything. He understood too late. The weight of the evening lingered like an unfinished chapter, but it no longer suffocated me the way it had before. Instead, I felt clarity expanding inside my chest, pushing out the doubt that once lived there. Pain still lingered, but it wasn't controlling me. It was changing me. And transformation often begins in the quietest moments. When dinner finally ended, people moved cautiously, offering hesitant goodbyes as if unsure whether they were leaving a crime scene or a confession. I responded politely but without shrinking, letting my voice carry naturally without forcing it into softness. It felt strange to speak from strength instead of fear, but freeing. As we stepped outside to leave, Marcelline touched my arm, her grip lighter than it had ever been, as though afraid I would pull away. For the first time, her confidence faltered completely, and she whispered an apology so quiet it barely reached her own ears. But apologies without understanding are just words. I didn't respond immediately, not because I wished to hurt her, but because I needed a moment to understand my own emotions. Her apology didn't erase the humiliation, the dismissiveness, or the pattern of belittling I had tolerated for far too long. It wasn't a beginning. It was a symptom of everything breaking open. She asked if we could talk later, her voice trembling with uncertainty, realizing perhaps that she had crossed a line she could never fully walk back from. Her eyes searched mine for reassurance, for the version of me who always soothed and forgave. But that version of me wasn't standing there anymore. Something had shifted permanently. I simply nodded without promising anything, letting her feel the weight of uncertainty she had repeatedly placed on me. It wasn't revenge. It was balance returning to a space where I had carried too much for too long. For once, she was the one left questioning her place instead of me. As I walked away from the house that night, the air felt clearer, carrying both the ache of what happened and the strength I had begun to reclaim. Grandma's words echoed in my mind, not as comfort anymore, but as truth carving a new foundation beneath me. I wasn't healed, but I was no longer lost. And though I didn't know what the future held, whether reconciliation, separation, or something entirely different, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again let someone define me with a single word meant to break me. That power no longer belonged to anyone but me. The morning after the dinner felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself had paused to let me understand everything that had shifted inside me. I woke up with the weight of humiliation still lingering, but beneath it was something new, an unfamiliar steadiness that made my breast feel fuller than before. It wasn't confidence yet, but it was the beginning of a version of myself I had long forgotten. I spent the early hours reflecting on the night, tracing every moment from the inside. I listened quietly, allowing her to finish without interrupting, because healing doesn't come from silencing someone. It comes from finally hearing them clearly. She admitted she spoke that way because she never understood the strength in quiet people and feared appearing weak herself. Her honesty didn't excuse the pain, but it finally named it. When she asked if we could start over, her eyes searched mine for the version of myself that once lived for her approval. But that version wasn't here anymore, replaced by someone who finally understood the difference between love and self-erasure. I realized then that forgiveness didn't mean returning to who I was. It meant protecting who I was becoming. I told her calmly that change wasn't impossible, but it required more than apologies. It needed understanding, respect, and the willingness to rebuild without repeating patterns that break people. My voice didn't shake this time. It carried the weight of someone who had finally stepped into his own worth, and she felt the difference instantly. We talked for a long time, honestly, quietly, without performance, acknowledging the cracks that had grown between us and the parts of ourselves we had both ignored. Whether our relationship would survive wasn't clear, but for the first time, the decision didn't feel like a matter of fear. It felt like a choice built on clarity rather than desperation. After she left, I stepped outside and breathed in the cool air, feeling it fill the parts of me that had been hollow for years. The sky looked wider somehow, as if the world had expanded with the space I finally gave myself inside my own life. And in that quiet moment, I understood that real strength doesn't shout. It endures, grows, and stands. Grandma joined me later, her steps slow but steady, and when she looked at me, she didn't need to ask anything. She could see the shift, the way a person changes when they finally stop allowing someone else's words to define them. She smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition. I had finally seen myself the way she always had. She told me